My name is Chad Lubelsky. Mon nom est Chad Lubelsky. Je travaille pour la Fondation de la J.W. McConnell à Montréal. It is a great pleasure and honor to be with you here today. I really want to thank the Ashoka team, and for those of you who haven't yet had the great pleasure of working with Emily Lamb, I just really want to say, do whatever you can in your lives to get to work with Emily. I don't think she's in the room now, but she's absolutely amazing. This morning, something really interesting happened, and you may see in your programs, we did a land acknowledgement. And I just want to speak about that for 1 second, because not everybody might understand why or what that is, and even actually how it might be relevant to our conversation here today. So in Canada, as Janet mentioned, we're trying, and I would say really with at best mixed success, of undergoing a generational process of reconciliation with our Indigenous peoples. And for us, or for our Indigenous people, we take a 7-generation view of that, which means we see this as a process that will last hundreds of years. So it is very, very difficult work, and reconciliation is reciprocal, right? It needs to go both ways. So we do the land acknowledgement for 2 reasons, as I understand it, and I am not an expert in this by any means. But one reason we do it is to acknowledge the contested history that we have and who actually owns the land that we're currently on. And that's it. As you can imagine, what was going on here in the States and the Dakotas, that is a very important issue. But there's a second reason, which I think is probably more germane, or as germane, to why we're here now. Because in acknowledging the land, we recognize that we're in relationship with the land and the people that were on it. And as we've been talking about, relationships are key to all of this work. And so in acknowledging the land, we then come into a different relationship with the land and with us and with who's already on it. And what we're seeing is if we want to have the social change that we're looking for, we need to be in different relationships. So that's part of the land acknowledgement, and really hats off to Ashoka for doing that. As I understand it, it's the first time they've done it. And hats off to the Canadians and to Danica, because as I understand it, it's part of the Canadian influence on the Ashoka network that Ashoka decided to do that. The second way I'm going to go a little bit off script is when I was reviewing my PowerPoint this morning, and I looked at the title, so post-secondary solutions for today and tomorrow. If I'm honest with you, I bristled a little bit when I saw that we put in the word solutions. And by we, I mean I. And I thought of a great quote by an English, and by English I mean British, writer. His last name is Gaiman, I'm forgetting his first name, but he talks about how for people who identify problems in the world, they're probably right. So when someone says there's this issue and there's this issue, yes, you're right. There is that issue, but then when they come forward and they say this is how to solve it, this is the solution, they're probably wrong, right? And I think that's really key because we don't actually know how to change the world. If we did, the world would already be changed. Everybody wants a better world, right? That's not an ideological thing. Right? We probably disagree somewhat on how to go about doing it, right? But fundamentally, I have no idea how to change the world, right? And I don't think people in this room, with all respect and all humility, like if we did, we'd be getting better at it. And I think we are getting better at it, but there's obviously much work to do. So I'm not convinced that we actually have the solutions. And that just brings me to one other quote, if you'll permit me. In Canada, about 10 years ago, there was a seminal book published about social innovation and social change called Getting to Maybe. And it was a reaction to the book Getting to Yes, right? And the idea was you can't get to yes, right? The best we can do, our aspirations, our hope is to get to maybe. And it's written by Brenda Zimmerman, Francis Wesley, and Michael Patton. Michael Patton is based in Minnesota. He's an evaluator. And then there's 2 Canadian academics. And they wrote, this is a story in progress, a transformation underway. But that is one of the important things about social innovation. It is not a fixed address. By the time we arrive, the destination has changed. The destination has changed, right? So it takes perseverance as well as patience. And the story that I want to tell you today, in the 7 minutes that I have left, is how we've changed our story. Okay, so I work for a pan-Canadian foundation. We're based in Montreal. We fund in a number of different areas, and globally speaking, our work is to build a more resilient Canada. And what we mean by that is a Canada that's better able to adapt to our social, cultural, economic, and environmental challenges. So we use social innovation to do that, to build what we would call adaptive capacity. And RECODE is a granting program as well as a network building program. Okay, so we launched RECODE 4 years ago, and we made many, many mistakes. Essentially, we were supply-driven and not demand-driven. And what I mean by that is we, in many ways, although we weren't cognizant of it at the time, of course, but I think we made a classic misstep of a funder, which is we said, we know what has to happen, right? And so we did this granting program, and the granting program worked well, but then we also tried to build a network. And because we have a lot of power, right, we have a lot of resources, we're able to bring people to the table and do all sorts of things. We tried to push things onto a system, right? So we tried to build a network, a social innovation network, and we kind of fell a little bit flat on our faces. And it was, quite honestly, it was a very difficult experience for us as a funder. And there were some people, where's James? James has been with us since the beginning of Mount Royal. Thankfully, he stayed with us. And he's seen the work evolved as we look into trying to do what we're now thinking of as building a movement, right? So some of what I want to talk about today is how we've shifted our thinking on how to do that work, right? And how to have it to be more reactive to what the institutions say that they're actually looking for. And so we sat back, we went for a bit of a walk in the woods, as we would call it in Canada, and we thought, okay, well, what is it that we actually have, and what is it that we're trying to do? And one of the things we very quickly realized, and the people in the room know this, is that we have a very strong base, right? We've seen it just here now this morning. There is incredible work happening at all of our institutions, right? It's inspired, it's inspiring, it's creative, it's necessary, and it's beautiful, right? But we also know that it's not enough. Right? Even if we're going in the right direction, it is not fast enough, right? We have to accelerate. We have to scale, right? But then we have the challenge of that we don't quite know how to do it, right? But we know that education is a great equalizer, right? In terms of social mobility, all of these things. And we also know, at least in Canada, enrollment is actually going up. So there's still a need, for a desire for education. So what we decided to do, based on our work with Ashoka, and our understanding of how Ashoka was looking for success is to work with what we called exemplar institutions, right? We wanted to amplify and cluster breakthroughs because we think of institutional change and systems change, and specifically in post-secondary, which is an older institution. We think of it a little bit as a cruise liner, right? They go, right? They're big, right? They're moving, but once they start to sort of turn ever so slightly, then that momentum keeps them going, right? They're gonna keep turning, right? So that's the work that we're trying to do, and we were very receptive. We received, so McConnell Foundation has funded post-secondary for over 80 years. We're Canada's oldest foundation, and we received very difficult feedback from good friends who told us that we needed to learn to walk before we could run in terms of creating social change in post-secondary, right? 600-year-old institution, they were like, you need to tread a little bit more carefully and a little bit more slowly here. So that's what we started to do. So along with our friends at Simon Fraser University, I'm going to do a shout out to Joanne in the back of the room, and Coral Strandberg, who wrote a white paper on this, who's based in Burnaby, just outside Vancouver, BC. We wrote a paper on social infrastructure. And social infrastructure ties together actually a lot of what you were talking about earlier around the civic engaged university. But the idea is, with social infrastructure, is that it ties together. It's exactly this. It's using the institutional resources, all of these, for social good, right? But it's not just academic. It's not just research. It's not just teaching. The idea is that those are core functions that our schools do, and this is work that becomes complementary to it. And it's also a holistic and a complete frame, right? Because what we saw is that notwithstanding the amazing work happening at our institutions, it wasn't connected, right? And some of what we were even just talking about this morning is that it needs to be better connected. We need to be breaking silos. In a sense, we need the institutional team of teams, right, that Bill Drayton was talking about this morning that we're not getting, right? So we see social infrastructure as both a frame for how to do it and a series of activities that can be done. And I'll just do a quick plug if you're interested. I brought some copies of the paper along with specific examples and then some of our lessons learned, which, yes, over there, just holding up. Okay, great. Okay, and this is key. So Andrew Petter, who's the president of Simon University and who's a visionary and incredibly courageous in this work, I just really want to underline this mutually beneficial part. Right, so quite frankly, we often go to schools, and I know that there are some directors of research in the room, and we go and we speak to researchers, and they say, well, we already do it. We do community engagement, right? And we do research. And yes, that is part of it, but the difference here is that this is reciprocal. This is the community changing the institution, right? So it goes both ways. And that's harder work to do, right? Let's be really clear about that. And it's working with people and changing relationships so that when it's much easier to say no, people actually say yes, right? And I think that ties back a little bit to what we were talking about, the opening speaker, the doctor whose name I'm forgetting this morning, thank you, who was saying we have to connect it to purpose, right? Because people will only say yes when it's easier to say no, I think, if it's actually connected to their purpose, right? And why they're there. And that's, we could learn a lot from our indigenous, neighbors, friends, colleagues who take a 7th-generation view, right, on how to do that, at least Canadian First Nations. I'm less familiar with ones in the United States. Okay. These are the different things that social infrastructure challenges us to do, right? I'll let you take a look at that slide for just 1 second, but I'm just going to really underline this one to scale and accelerate our contributions. Because that's the work that's most needed. And if I can say, with all respect to our US cousins here, it's so shocking to me to come here and to twice, like already this morning, 2 people refer to, these are true facts that I'm talking about. It is funny, and I do believe that we do, you can do serious work and not always be serious about it, but I also find that incredibly sobering. And to the Canadians, I find it terrifying because we always refer to the Americans and their problems, but we elected Rob Ford, right? Our biggest city, which is always held up as a halcyon, right, of diversity and openness, elected the most populous mayor, right? And you might elect his brother to be our premier. We have huge problems in our country. I won't even go into Quebec, right, and what goes on there. So it's in our backyards as well. Okay. There's 2 broad reasons to do it, right? I can go into more detail. I know I'm at time, but we can make a business case to why it should be done, but also because it's the work that we need and should be doing, right? For all the reasons that we already know. Here's what we're seeing, right? And yesterday we did have Canada Day, and one of the things that we talked about was how it felt different, right? So what we're seeing in Canada, at least, is that the work is going well. People are looking for these frameworks. This might not be a framework that works for you, and I'm not suggesting that it is, but it could be, right? And there probably are others, right? But the global frame here that I think is important is that if this work is always off the side of your desk, right? If it's always barnacled on to what it is that you're trying to do, right? You're not going to achieve, I don't think we are going to achieve the change that we're looking to achieve, right? It's incumbent upon us to figure out how to integrate it into all of the work that we try and do across our institution so that this becomes part of the institution, right? And that means breaking across silos, right? Working in teams of teams and looking for frames that are appealing to people, right? Because then this is the potential, right? This is the vision, right? Stronger institutions and stronger communities, right? That's what we're all aiming to do. The ultimate goal, right, is beyond the institution, right? It encourages us to think beyond the specific institution that we're thinking about. Because ultimately, it's like the goal of this in a certain sense and in trying to get the work done, it reminds me, there's Le Petit Prince, right, which we all read in Canada. I'm not sure if you do in the States. The Little Prince, it's probably called. But this little boy, he goes traveling, right? And then he comes back, and the goal of the travel, right, isn't to go and see new things, but it's to come back where you already were and see the horizon with new eyes, right? And ultimately, I think that's the work that we need to be doing in our institutions. So thank you very much.